This is softly spoken Ariel ASMR. I'm wrinkling this bag. Got it from a liquor store after buying a bottle of 100 proof whiskey. It's really relaxing, I think, the sound. Not as relaxing as the feeling I felt when I drank the whiskey. But still, it's a pretty relaxing sound, I think.
Anyways. Sorry. So this was on, I think, a video I made called Sexual Attraction versus Romantic Attraction. Da Kid writes, I need help. I'm a female and I met this guy a year ago and we are deeply in love. Butterflies and crazy euphoria. But I don't get horny with him. I don't know why. It's so weird. Why? In other words, I don't find him sexually attractive, just attractive. And the answer is, I don't know, because I'm not you. I don't know what your feelings are. Maybe it sounds like if you are deeply in love, that it sounds like you probably have a romantic attraction, but you don't have a sexual attraction. And I think that's something you have to figure out. And sometimes that's tricky, you know, to what degree is sexual attraction an important part of a relationship with you? And to what degree do you want that? And to what degree does this guy expect sex from a relationship? If there's an incompatibility there, then maybe it won't work. This won't work out as a relationship. But if you do have this connection, maybe it could work out as a friendship. Or maybe it does, because sex isn't everything that's part of a relationship. And maybe if you are deeply in love, and if sex isn't that important to either of you, then maybe you can that can work out. It's something to think about. I don't have an easy answer for you because I don't know. I guess a starting place would be, well, what do you expect out of a relationship? If do you want sex out of a relationship? Does this guy you met want sex out of a relationship? Is that a need that you both have, or is it not? What I would recommend is just be honest. Neither of you should feel pressured to do anything you're uncomfortable with. If you're not interested in having sex with this guy, you shouldn't feel pressured to. So Punk Biscuit asks, question, in regards to attraction and pansexuality, is one sexually attracted to people of all gender, or could it be just spiritual or emotional attraction? For example, I find all genders attractive. I think some dudes are fucking hot, though I wouldn't want to take their dick. But I am sexually attracted to those with a vagina. However, I am capable of being attracted mentally, spiritually, and emotionally to all genders. Since I can find men visually attractive, but not sexually, would I be considered pansexual, polysexual, or just comfortably straight? So I wrote, you might consider yourself pan-romantic if you're capable of being attracted mentally, spiritually, and emotionally to all genders. Sometimes people have romantic preferences that aren't quite the same as their sexual preferences. For example, if a man is romantically attracted to all genders but is only sexually attracted to women, he might say he's pan-romantic and heterosexual. Sometimes your romantic attraction isn't quite the same as your sexual attraction, and that's fine. On the sexual attraction versus romantic attraction video, blonde science fiction fan writes, thank you. I've been looking for this kind of thing since 6th grade. Thank you. Homosexual, hetero-romantic here. I've been identifying as pan to a lot of my friends, but maybe I should identify as poly or queer. My mom says I should try it out, but then again, this is the same woman who says I'll even out because my brother is bi and he's with a woman now, and that I'll do the same thing. I wish sometimes I could just get into a relationship with a girl and have it last just to say, fuck you, this isn't something you even out over. But I can't. And that makes me feel like I'm failing, that I'm a jerk, and that I'm broken somehow. It doesn't help that I had a bigoted Christian Bible Belt upbringing until I moved in 7th grade, and it's still ringing in my head. Sorry, I never get to talk to anyone about this that I can actually relate fully. And I said, don't worry, you're not broken. You can use whatever identity you think best describes your sexuality, but if you want a term that's more of a general term that means not entirely heterosexual, queer is a good word for that, I think. Side note, some people find the term problematic still. because it has been used in the past as a slur, essentially, and some people still interpret it that way. But I personally, I like the term queer, and sometimes I refer to myself as queer. But I try to be sensitive about that now a little bit more than I have in the past. I would try not to worry about proving anything to your mom. When exploring the possibility of relationships, you should consider what you need and want out of a relationship and be honest with any people you try to start a relationship with. For instance, if you are interested in sexual relationships with a girl but aren't interested in a long-term romantic relationship with her, you should just let her know that you aren't interested in having a long-term committed relationship with her. Similarly, if you want to be in a romantic relationship with a boy, but still want to be able to have sexual relationships with girls, you should be honest with him about that. But then again, just because you feel like you're generally more romantically attracted to boys and more sexually attracted to girls doesn't mean you can't find someone who fulfills both your romantic and sexual needs. The important thing is to be aware of what you want and need from relationships and being honest with the people you initiate relationships with. Purple Fox asks, if you're attracted to someone that's transgender, are you bisexual or gay/lesbian or straight? Someone asked to answer this for me. Someone by the name of They Call Me Jewel S. It depends on what gender you identify as and what the other person identifies as. Yep, that's accurate. Speaking of transgender people, including yours truly, here's a bunch of questions regarding trans people, including non-binary people. Tierra Pearson writes, Facebook needs to stop using his/her when updating. It's rude. Hashtag Facebook gender options. I agree. I haven't had that happen. Facebook always has these weird problems. Like, first of all, just their whole thing they came out with like a few years ago that I made a thing on. And they still kind of have this policy, and it still does negatively affect trans people in particular. This whole real name policy. You're technically only supposed to have your real name. They really limit how many times you can change your name on Facebook. They're really picky about that. I have a lot of problems with Facebook. I'm very much limiting how much I'm using Facebook. I will say one thing that really annoyed me is they insisted on putting like a former name that I don't make public generally, or I stopped making public as far as I know, or I certainly didn't want it to appear right next to my name. And they just decided to put that up for some reason. And I had to go out of my way to change that. Sometimes I think they're trying their best, but there's just some things that happen on Facebook. I think they could do a little better. I could go on a whole rant about all my problems with Facebook. My problems with Facebook didn't even necessarily, that caused me to really stop using it, didn't even have to do with problems as a transgender person on Facebook. I think just in general what a lot of the atmospheres of people's Facebooks become, I don't know. I don't think it's always healthy. Anyways, yes, I agree. I think they should not do that. They should, if you choose they, them, their as your pronoun on Facebook, they should stick to that. Freshkilla writes, I'm trying to understand this. I googled it and this was the first video that came up. So help me to understand. You're trans and a natural born male, so if you're trans, aren't you identifying as a woman? I just need someone to explain it to me, is all. I mispronounced your name, so apologize. I apologize in advance. Ignatius, who has actually written a lot of comments on videos, a lot of times responding to other people's questions. And thank you. That's really helpful, especially since for the past year or more, I've been really bad about responding to comments because I just was too stressed to even bother going through the comments. But a lot of people like Ignatius are doing a great job for me, and so I don't even have to worry about it. So thank you. So Ignatius writes, trans means that you do not identify as the gender you were assigned at birth. For example, when I was born, doctors looked at my baby genitalia and said that I was a girl and that I was going to become a woman. I am not those things, so I am trans. I personally identify as genderqueer. Me too. And that is who I am and how I live. People who are told they were men who are actually self-identify as women are considered to be binary and trans women. But there's also non-binary trans women who identify as women, but maybe not wholly, or maybe they identify with something else too. Hope that makes sense. Yeah, I think that made sense to me. I don't know if Freshkilla didn't write any more things. I don't identify as a woman. I don't consider myself to be a woman. When I say the term trans and I use the term transgender, Some people think, I guess some non-binary people consider non-binary to be something separate from trans, or some people use the term transgender just to specifically describe being a trans woman or being a trans man. I use it to mean simply that I do not identify with my assigned gender. So I do not, even though I was assigned male at birth, I do not identify as male. I identify as genderqueer, similar to Ignatius, and so I don't identify as female or male. Val Chronification writes, I just think it's pretentious. Ignatius writes, why? Because we have been forced to educate ourselves on some advanced gender studies shit in order to justify our existence to everyone in our lives. We exist whether or not it's hard for you to understand. It's not like we reached a point of enlightenment and realized we transcended gender itself. It's that we were this way, and labels and words to explain it came after. It's important to understand that there are people who don't fit male or female, and it's not pretentious, and we aren't asking for anything special outside of our right to exist as we are. I agree with that. Someone writes, I want to be open, but there are just too many genders now. Ignatius, again, you're really helping me out. Ignatius has been really helpful in the comments. How Ignatius put this, I actually really appreciate this. You don't actually have to learn them all. Like, I don't know the name of every city out there, but I'm not going to just go and say it doesn't exist. If I meet someone from there, I'll learn that it exists, and that's fine. It's not any different. Yes, I think it's overwhelming if someone just gives you a list of every single gender that someone could possibly, which I mean, it's impossible because, you know, people come up with new terms all the time because a lot of times people have, you know, a hard, you know, like feel like they need a specific term to describe how they feel about their gender or how they understand their gender, or they need a new word to reflect their specific gender identity. And yeah, I get that it can be overwhelming if you just see like all these, you know, terms that you're unfamiliar with. First of all, understanding the term non-binary is a good place to start, because that's generally, I think most people kind of understand that as a term to kind of encompass all, or, you know, all or most identities that are, you know, not quite entirely male or not quite entirely female. You know, other good ones to recognize are genderqueer, gender fluid, you know, agender. And I think if you try and if you kind of understand the basics, just understand that there are some people that do not consider themselves entirely male or entirely female, or just don't feel that they're male or female at all, that they're a gender different from that. I think that's a good place to start. And just trying your best. Some people might get offended if you ask questions, but I feel like most trans people, if you are like, okay, what do I need to be able to be respectful to you? What should I do to respect your identity? If you come at it with that attitude, then I feel like most trans people would be happy to explain some of the basics, or to just point you towards some resources, or, you know, just say, okay, I'm genderqueer, and if you just Google it, then that's probably should explain it. Okay, this was on the cissexism, transphobia, and cisnormativity video. Hi, question for you. The vocabulary in your video, is it used to normalize trans people? In listening, I feel like the terms exist to make non-trans / cis people both aware of how a trans person sees the non-trans / cis world, make that non-trans / cis person a little uneasy to give them empathy towards trans people. And I wrote, part of it is definitely trying to help cisgender people empathize with transgender people. It's also to encourage people not to make assumptions about others based on the expectation that everyone is cisgender. Of course, it's often really hard to not make cis-sexist statements ever, and saying something cis-sexist doesn't make someone a bad person, but it's something that's good to be mindful of if you want to help trans people feel validated in their identities. So this was a video, and I'm glad that I got a comment like this from Steven Santos. This was a person who came at it with an open mind. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people that didn't take this video with an open mind and thought that I was just like suggesting that if anybody ever made a cis-sexist statement, or if anybody ever did any of these things, that they're a bad person and that they're, you know, horrible and need to be shamed for that. No, not at all. And I mean, I've probably made my fair share of cis-sexist statements and enforced cisnormativity in ways that I don't even know. It's hard because we're kind of taught it from a young age. And, you know, at the end of the day, most people are cisgender. and most people probably always will be cisgender. Maybe not, but probably. These words are not meant to, like cissexism and cisnormativity, these words aren't intended to attack anyone, and it's not intended to blame anyone, or at least I'm not intending to use these terms or introduce these terms or define these terms to attack anyone. I'm just defining and explaining these terms just as tools so that people can be a little bit more conscious about how the experience of a trans person is different, and how to, if you are interacting with trans people, how to, maybe try to think a little differently about just how you interact with others. What kind of assumptions you're making based on gender, or based on what you perceive a person's gender to be.
Nick Rocks writes, I love your vlog/video ideas. If you could you please make a video about AMAB, non-binary/trans people, and just touch on this topic, like how they aren't represented or accepted a lot? Because me, as an AMAB, agender person, I've noticed very little representation in the queer community.
So first of all, just for people who don't know what AMAB means, it means assigned male at birth, meaning people who when they were born, people told them that they're male. So for example, I'm an AMAB person. I can only speak from my experiences, and it does depend on what you mean by represented, because the thing that is interesting is, well, not all AMAB people, but specifically trans women, I do feel like in the media have, certainly historically, and I would still say to the present, are actually more represented. There probably are, like, probably most people, when they just hear the word transgender, they probably think of a trans woman. I think that is a common narrative in the media. However, just from my experiences, I have noticed that a lot of times when we're dealing with, like, people high school age, maybe middle school age, and even early college age, there are a lot of circumstances where you find more often that most non-binary people that you meet, most trans people that you meet, are AFAB, so assigned female at birth. So either trans men or just non-binary AFAB people. I wouldn't profess to necessarily be an expert, but I think that is for a few reasons. For example, I was sort of out-ish to my friends throughout high school, as in about my gender identity. I started figuring it out in high school and started really questioning it in high school. I wasn't necessarily totally sure, but I was pretty sure I was non-binary. Like, there was a few different terms I kind of was like, I guess I'm kind of like gender queer, or I'm I had a few different ideas. There were some times when I thought I was a trans woman, but I never really felt entirely comfortable in thinking of myself as that, because I'm not a woman. I don't think I'm a woman. A lot of times, if you went to, like, when I went to certain LGBTQ plus support groups, a lot of times there would be a lot more AFAB people out as trans. I dated a transgender boy in high school, but I wasn't comfortable being totally out about it. I told some of my friends that I was questioning my gender identity, so a lot of them were aware. For a few reasons I wasn't comfortable. I would say mostly it was like, it wasn't even less than like the school. It was, let's just say, family reasons. There's reasons why, and I think in terms of that issue of representation, when we're talking about high school and early college, there's certain reasons why I think a lot of times AMAB people have difficulty coming out. For one, expressing, when you are someone who is raised from a young age to present as male, that you're supposed to present as male, presenting in a way, expressing, gender identity outwardly, which, by the way, if you're non-binary, that doesn't mean that you have to dress or express yourself in a way that's more typically considered androgynous. That's not something you have to do, but a lot of times that's how a lot of us do tend to outwardly express our gender. Part of that's just sincerely, I like how I look with makeup. I like how I look in clothing that is more typically considered feminine.
That's just a genuine preference of mine. But, you know, it's also a way of outwardly kind of signaling to the world, hey, maybe I'm not a man. And I think a lot of times you feel like in order to really be considered valid as a trans person, you have to express yourself like that. But there's a fear, particularly when you're in high school, that if I go to school in a skirt, or if I go to school wearing makeup, or if I go to school like this, if I express this, then or if I'm open about this, then I will not be accepted. And it's not that AFAB people don't face that, but I think that AMAB people, it's a little different. I think that people have been taught to see AMAB people who dress a little bit more femininely, or who express themselves a little there's a fear there. I think a lot of people kind of fear or don't take seriously or treat it like a joke the kind of I think what a lot of people would see as the man wearing the dress, which is a problematic phrase for the record. But when people kind of see this idea of people they perceive as a man dressing feminine, there's a fear there, there's a discomfort there, and sometimes that's hard to overcome. I think there's a lot of reasons why. A lot of times it's not that there's less AMAB trans people. It's not that there's less AMAB non-binary people at all. And historically, again, there's been trans women, and I'd even go as far as to say like non-binary trans AMAB people have been more represented than AFAB people. And it's a tricky thing. It's always with any of these things, and I've gotten comments like this before, and I've had people make comments like, talk about how it's harder to be AMAB than it is to be AFAB, and I try to steer away from that to a certain degree, because I don't like the idea of making it making it a competition about who has it harder. I think that opens up a can of worms that doesn't necessarily need to be opened. I don't think that's what this commenter is getting at, by the way. I do think that there is a true phenomenon where I don't know if this is what they're talking about, but there definitely is a true phenomenon of AMAB people being less representative, being less visible, as particularly high school age, middle school age, and college age. And I think also part of that is, I think the tricky thing, part of the narrative that's tricky is particularly with like if you're a trans woman, or if you're just an AMAB transgender person who is non-binary. One thing you face is the narrative of the young transgender kids. And at least when I think that fortunately now we're getting more perspectives, but I remember when I was in high school, when I would search about the experience of being trans, and a lot of times the first thing that would come up when my parents would search, oh, I have a transgender kid, what do I do, into Google, you hear a lot of cases of like the Jazz Jennings of the world, which, by the way, no hate towards people like Jazz Jennings. I think it's great that she was able to transition from an early age. I think that is, for a lot of people, for people who experience gender dysphoria, or who start to understand their gender identity from a really early age, it is great if they are empowered to explore that. I think it's great that that Jazz Jennings and people like her have been able to transition from an early age. But the fact is, for various reasons, that's not a narrative that everyone falls into. And that's certainly not a narrative that I fell into. Having that as a dominant narrative, and I think some people who have the misconception that, oh, from a young age, you have to feel a certain way and you have to demonstrate certain tendencies. Like, so if I didn't put on makeup as a kid, or if I didn't express a desire to wear dresses as a really young kid, then that means that my feelings now are invalid. So I think that's something, and I think that a lot of times AMAB people do experience that in particular, just because I think there are more extreme cases that have been discussed of, at least when I was in high school and when I was like looking up stuff and when my parents were looking up stuff, a lot of times these cases of trans girls coming out as trans at really young ages were the ones that the news focused on because they were more easy to sensationalize. I hope that kind of addressed this a little bit. Also, to Nick Rocks, I would be very curious to hear your take on it because it might be very different than mine. It might be a very different experience. I certainly haven't felt like explicitly excluded from queer and LGBTQIA plus spaces. Sometimes there's been cases where I just didn't necessarily feel like I particularly fit in, but I don't think that's necessarily it wasn't due to any exclusionary action. But yes, I do notice that a lot of times there are less of these voices, and I definitely knew that there's definitely been cases where I've been at a support group or I've been just existing, and I'm like one of the very few out AMAB trans people. That's definitely been very common. Not an uncommon experience for me. And a lot of times there are more AFAB people who are represented. And again, I think it's due to, I think a lot of times for whatever reason, AFAB people, I think for a few reasons, are more comfortable. They start to be more comfortable being like, I'm a trans man, or I'm non-binary, or I'm genderqueer, I'm gender fluid, etc. at a younger age, at high school or middle school. And it's not that AMAB people don't experience that. It's just that I think a lot of times it's harder for us to come out during those times for a few reasons, because I think people treat that with a little bit more shock, or a little bit more like, oh, this is a thing. This is a real thing that we have to deal with, and that's like, and I think there's certain stigmas like that, whereas if you go like, a lot of times with AFAB people, I think there's a lot of times the opposite problem, where you'll come out and you'll be like, I'm a trans man, or I'm non-binary, I'm genderqueer, and people, the opposite problem, they often just don't take it seriously. They're like, oh yeah, sure, I'll go along with that, but they don't really take it seriously, which is its own problem, and it has its own problems, but it makes it easier for that initial coming out. And I think a lot of times AFAB people, there's an experience where like even their parents will be like, oh yeah, sure, and they won't be too shocked by it at first, but then when they find out, oh, this is not a phase, then that's where, and then I think that's what's a difficult thing to deal with for a lot of AFAB people. I might be totally, again, I don't want to speak for everybody, and I know that different people have different experiences, but yeah, I mean, a lot of times there's that moment, you think that you're in the clear because your parents seem cool with it, or people seem cool with it, but then when you're like, oh, actually, I think I want to go on testosterone, then they're like, oh, wait a second, this is a little too real for me now. I thought this was just a thing that I was going to go along with, but no, this is real. Fuck. And then you suddenly get pushback from your parents where you didn't expect it, because they seemed like they were being cool. Whereas I think AMAB people, a lot of times, because there's more of an association, especially if they're like, oh, are you a trans woman? There's unfortunately a stigma that carries that is different, and I think people are more likely to take it seriously. But the problem with that is it's while it, in a way, it's good to be kind of validated that it's a real thing, and that you're not just making something up. The danger with that is that also a lot of people are scared of it. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of someone being assigned male at birth, saying that they're a woman, or saying that they're non-binary,
or expressing themselves in a way that's more typically considered feminine. I mean, frankly, yeah, that's the thing, is it's hard to even experiment with how with your gender expression as an AMAB person a lot of times, because there's a stigma, you know, even if you're like, okay, I'm a man, but I want to experiment with wearing makeup. I want to experiment with wearing a dress. I want to do this. A lot of times people will either think it's a joke, and then there's sometimes what's even worse than like people, because I don't really care if people like think that like I look funny if I'm wearing a dress, or they think I look funny because I'm wearing makeup, you know, like fine, like I don't really care if that's your sense of humor. Then whatever. I mean, I think that you have you're very easy to amuse if that's, you think that it's hilarious that I'm just wearing makeup, and you think it's hilarious that I'm just wearing a dress. I mean, the easiest laugh I can get. But and I sometimes try to make people laugh. I think the danger is then when there's that moment of like recognition. Oh shit, this isn't a joke. This person's really like, this is a real thing. Oh shit. And that's like I think is the worst thing. I definitely would consider maybe doing a video where I like address like kind of specific issues, unique issues that AFAB people and AMAB people face. But probably I'd maybe want to have collaborators on that, like, you know, an AFAB perspective or other AMAB perspectives, so I don't feel like I'm speaking for a lot of people who might have very different experiences than I have. I originally wanted to do this all in one video, but there were just too many comments that I wanted to respond to, so I've decided to split them up into a few different videos. Hopefully the next video will be out in a day or two. Thanks for watching!